available for others to tap into. My name's Carl Hilton Van Osdal. I'm the chair of the Leadership Commission of the Presbytery of Northern New England and pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Barrie. And we're really glad that you've joined us. Can people still hear me okay? Thumbs up on that. Okay. Oh, great. So yeah, glad you joined us for, this is the third in a series of regathering conversations. And as we're meeting today on the eve of Earth Day, and during Interfaith Power and Light's Climate Action Week, I thought I'd use a poem by Wendell Berry as an opening prayer. This is one called The Peace of the Wild Things. Maybe you've heard it. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and where the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of the wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Amen. So again, just to welcome, we are doing this in a series. We're in the third of a series where we'll talk at the end about where we want to go from here, if it's helpful to have these regathering conversations on some regular basis. So I look forward to that conversation, and maybe you'll make some mental notes as we go along of, if we continue to gather with some regularity, what topics you might want to make sure we get to. So with that, I'll hand things over to colleague and friend Megan Manus.
Hey everybody, so today we have a very special guest who I'm really excited to introduce to you all. We have Dr. Aaron Young, who is a member at First Quincy. His Pastor Drew is also here representing. Let me read you his bio, unless you weren't already impressed by the fact that he wanted to share his knowledge in a free webinar with us on a Wednesday afternoon. But Dr. Young is an assistant professor of physiology and biophysics at Boston University School of Medicine. He serves as the co-director of the first-year principles integrating science and medicine curriculum of the MD program. And in addition to providing leadership and administration for all the foundational basic science disciplines, Dr. Young is primarily involved in the physiology, endocrinology, and neuroscience education of medical, dental, and physician assistant students, and the supervision and mentorship of graduate students. Dr. Young was trained in Canada as a physiologist and pharmacologist with particular expertise in the respiratory, pulmonary, and cardiovascular systems of the human body. So he was like, little did you know you were preparing for such a time as this. And he's going to share with us about, all of those words that I pronounced hopefully correctly in his bio that mean that he knows about the things that are mystifying to some of us. So he's going to help demystify and help us to think about what we want to look for, what are the signs and the metrics that we need to be aware of. And with that, I will turn it over to him. He says it's fine if you would like to interrupt while he's presenting, if you have a question, you don't understand something, if you want to write into the chat, and Carl and I will interrupt on your behalf, that's also fine. But thank you so much, Aaron, for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, both Carl and Megan, for inviting me. I'm more than happy to speak to this group, and hopefully as we go through, as Megan mentioned, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to either type in the chat or unmute yourself and interrupt. That is how I like these sorts of things to go. You have questions, hopefully I can provide answers, and hopefully you leave today feeling like you have a better sense of what sort of data points and things we can look at. And so with that, I'll just go ahead and share my screen. So bear with me one second while I get that going. And you will have hopefully noticed that while we're waiting for the screen share to get going, I did also post a link in the chat to the latest version. I was able to update the slides slightly today with actually the most up-to-date current data as of today. So it's not really showing you anything different than what's in the previous PDF slides that were made available, but it's just current as of today. So if you have an interest or want to see that, you can certainly follow the link. So everybody's able to see this okay now, I hope. Excellent. So I think when we think about all of the different things that are going on now and all of the different things that weigh on us when we make different decisions about, as a church community, things like when should we, have in-person inside service, or when should we maybe try to host an event of some sort. I think one of the things that we want to be aware of is what's going on from a public health perspective. But I also think at the same time, for many, if not all of you, that type of a perspective is not part of your normal daily lives. If somebody asked you, what's the current state of public health in your town, in your community, and what about this virus and all these different, cases and things like that, I think most of you might say, I kind of hear about it in the news, but when it really comes down to it, or making a decision based on that sort of information, where do we start? I'm not really sure. And so that's, I think, where I wanted to begin, is to say, well, how can we approach some of this data, of which there is an inordinate amount, and how can we really try to make sense of it in a useful way to help inform our decisions? And I think the first thing to consider is what types of things are out there and available that you could be looking at, right? So things to consider reviewing. And I think, a few of the easiest ones and most readily available are things like looking at case rates. In other words, how many new cases are we seeing, each day, or on average each week? And other things like, how many fatalities are we seeing from COVID? Other things we could look at would be, how effectively are we testing? How many people are getting tested per day or per week? What's the rate of spread? How easily is the virus spreading within a community that we might be interested in? Other things you may look at are, how maxed out are our hospitals in our area? Are they dealing with the strain of COVID patients okay? Or are we near full occupancy, and is that a concern? And lastly, and I think probably the one that is probably in the forefront of most people's minds, is vaccination rates. How many people are vaccinated? What proportion of our community is vaccinated? What about different age groups? What percentage of those folks are vaccinated? So you can see that there's a lot of different things we could be looking at. So in terms of a strategy, I think it becomes important to think about, well, how do we approach this? The first and sort of foremost thing that I would want to recommend to everybody is make sure that when you're doing this, or when you're considering this, that you use reputable and reliable sources. I think one of the easiest things to do is just go, kind of doom scrolling through your news feed on your phone and immediately go, oh boy, this is a disaster. And the first thing I would recommend for most people to do is just turn that off, because that becomes a pit of, I think, despair. And it's very easy to kind of go down the rabbit hole and really get lost in that. The next thing I would say, and I'm going to provide some links to some good sources of data in a moment. I think the next thing is to think about the approach that you take. And the recommendation I have here is to start broad and then move more narrow, or more sort of contextually, look nationally, then maybe at your state level, and then more locally at, say, your county or your town or your city, and sort of that sort of three-step process. And in terms of what sorts of things to look at a few different things. Don't just pick one. And I think a lot of people just have now sort of singularly focused on what are the vaccination rates and sort of ignored everything else. The flip side is, There are so many different things you could be looking at. Don't put upon yourself to think that you need to review every single metric that exists, because that's never going to happen. And nor at one, after looking at a few, is it going to provide you any more insight, really. And so I think really what we want to do is focus on a few key things that we could be looking at, and then look at them sort of at the national, state, and local level. And that'll give you a good insight as to what's going on and help you to more inform the decisions you may need to make at different points. One of the easiest ways to do that is to use a traffic light approach. And that's kind of the example that we'll use going forward, is sort of the red, green, or yellow in terms of what is this metric telling us? Is it good? Are we kind of concerned, or is it not really very good at the moment? And so here are some great links that you can use to actually access these different types of data. The one that I would most strongly recommend, and is sort of the easiest source to get the most amount of data, is the Johns Hopkins website, which is shown here. And in a moment, I'll sort of walk you through. We'll actually go to the website and look at a few things. It's a great resource. It is a trusted, peer-reviewed resource that is updated regularly. And they provide data both from the national and also the state level, and even now, more specifically to, depending on the state we're looking at the county level as well. So it is a great source of information for these different types of metrics that you want to look at. There's also another one. This second one is actually out of the UK. And it actually will provide a similar level of data, but it also has data from all over the globe as well. And it's also a fantastic resource for information as well. And then the other thing is, if you want to look more locally, you can start looking at, say, your state's COVID specific or Department of Public Health website. Most states have pretty robust websites now with dashboards that present different data at the state and more local levels within the state. And so those are great resources as well. And so this is an example of what we at First Presby Quincy are looking at in terms of different metrics that we're considering to help inform our decisions. And so each one is a bullet point, and then the sub point in the text that's in purple is the expectations that we've set in terms of each one of these. What would we want to see in order to make that green? And that way, when we sort of meet week to week, we can be looking at the data and basically cook it down to, is it red, is it yellow, or is it green? And that, I think, makes it a lot more simple to approach, because at the end, yes, we can look at all the different data, but if you cook it down to this one sort of single page and you see a bunch of colored dots, that makes it pretty easy. Are they mostly red? Is it a mix of red and yellow? Are things mostly starting to turn green? That makes it, I think, easier when you think about where are we in order to appreciate things. And you can see we've started sort of more broadly at the national level. And then we start drilling down more specifically at sort of our local county and certainly the city of Quincy within which our church is, and start looking at these different things. The other thing I would say, and I've included my contact information, and it will be on the last slide once we get to the end of this session as well, is I realize that for a lot of people, when you look at these things, well, where do we set the bar in terms of what we want to see? And I realize most people here aren't epidemiologists. And so if you want some help thinking about what metrics would make sense for you or your community to look at, and what sort of thresholds would make sense, I'm certainly happy to have those conversations over email, or we can set up another sort of one-on-one time to have a Zoom meeting. I'm happy to do that with people if they would find that useful. Are you assigning the color level, or are these organizations using this kind of categorization? So it's a mix of both. We set the guidelines that you see in purple for most of these. A few of them, in terms of like the two here that I've sort of highlighted here on the right, these are actually set by our state of Massachusetts. Actually uses a color-coded system to rank counties and cities and towns. And so we're using our state's sort of classification in that regard. But the other ones, the more broad ones, we've sort of set, and then is it meeting that would be green. If it's not meeting it, but it's moving in that direction, yellow. And if it's sort of moving away from it, then it's red. And so what I wanted to do really quickly is just to show you the Johns Hopkins website, because I have a feeling many people probably haven't seen it, or maybe you've heard about it, but haven't had a chance to look at it yourself. So we'll just spend just a couple quick minutes to show you where you can find some of this information. And it's actually really easy to navigate. So if you follow that link and you go to the Johns Hopkins website, you end up initially on this sort of map, which I would immediately encourage you to immediately move away and start looking at some of the data, because if you look at the giant map in that, like I say, it's very easy for that to become a little bit overwhelming and feel a little bit, if I'm honest, feel a little bit depressed. But if you dig a little deeper, you can start looking a little more locally at the data. And one of the things I would suggest is if you tap on where it says critical trends, you get a pull down menu. And if you scroll through, the first thing you can look at is, have countries flattened the curve? Because now you can look at data in terms of case rates for the United States as a whole. It will also provide other countries as well. You can see we can actually scroll down, and now we can see the United States on the top left here. And so this is tracking that sort of solid orange line that you see is the 7-day moving average of new cases. And so you can see that in about April of 2020 is when we had our first peak. And then we had our second in about early mid-July. And then we sort of went through our third peak, hitting its max right about the end of 2020. And since then, until about March, we saw a pretty precipitous drop in cases, which was very encouraging and made sort of all the news and so on. You can see more recently now, as we get into April, that's actually kind of plateaued, or maybe actually started to rise again a little bit. One of the other useful things is you'll notice that right along the top, just above sort of where it says 300K, it looks like a little set of toolbar buttons just above that figure. The one on the far left looks like a little camera. If you click it, it will actually allow you to save and download that image. So all of these images are very easily accessible. If you say want to put them together into a report, for example, you can click and download them, cut and paste them into whatever you want to use them for. Very easily accessible in that regard. Along the very top, right next to where it says tracking in yellow, we can see it says testing. If we click on that, it brings us to, big surprise, information about testing rates and levels. And if you hit Insights, you get another pull down menu of all different kinds of options. One of the useful ones I like is the daily state to state trends. And the first thing it'll give you is nationally. So this is for the entire US. And that solid blue line is percent positivity. So of all the COVID tests that are done nationwide, how many or what percentage come back positive for COVID? And the World Health Organization and the CDC both agree that in order for things to be going well, you want a percent positivity less than 5%. And so that's kind of the expectation we set for that one. Is it less than 5%? And you can see right now nationally, it's not. We're actually right at or slightly above 5%. We have been for about the last week or so. So that, if you wanted to think about classifying it, would be red, right? Because it's not meeting the threshold that we would set or that we would want to see. And over the last week, it's actually been creeping up away or high or above 5%. And then if you want to look more specifically at a given state, you can click that pull down menu and say you want to look at Maine. So here's Maine. Or if you wanted to look at New Hampshire, here's New Hampshire. Right now it allows you to focus in more specifically on, say, a given state, for example. And just like we saw before, you can see that sort of in the top right of the figure, there's that little camera icon again. You can just click that and download and save it. And again, cut and paste it into any reports you may want to use in the future. The other bit of this website that's really good is along the very top. Now, instead of testing, if we click by region, now you see we have all the states, and you can say pick New Hampshire, let's say, for example, and it brings you up a state specific page now. And you can look, you can see for all time or over the past day, or the one that I think is most useful is what's been happening over the past week. And now you can see over the past week in New Hampshire, there's been this many new cases and this many fatalities, this many tests conducted, and the percent positivity, or how many of those tests have come back positive. You scroll down a little bit, it gives you information about vaccination rates in the state, gives you information about hospitalization, how occupied are hospital beds, and so on. And then you can scroll down. It also will then give you county specific information as well, in terms of, you've got a big pull down here of all different kinds of things you can look at, and it'll give you more county specific information as well. So this website is really sort of a nice one-stop shop, gives you a lot of information really easily. And again, it's all downloadable in terms of figures and images and so on. And it gets updated daily. So this is the most current readily available data that's out there. And it's all sort of really nicely curated. It's also a good source of information as well. If you click on vaccines just to the left of by region, it gives you lots of good information about sort of what's currently in the media. You know, what about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and why has it recently been paused? And should we be worried about that? What does that mean? So it's a good source of really good information coming, right from the source and trusted individuals, not sort of, a little bit more sort of inflated and so on for the news cycle. This is more sort of, a straight shot, good source of information. So that's the Johns Hopkins website. And so I just wanted to take a moment to show people that, because I think personally that's a really good one. It's really easily approachable and accessible for people, and gives you a lot of information all in one spot. So what types of information? So we said, well, we could start looking nationally first, and we saw this on the website, but I've cut and pasted it here. So you can see on the left, right, that orange line is looking at the average number of daily new cases. And you can see over the last little bit here, things have actually been sort of creeping up slightly, which in terms of, if we looked at that, we would call that sort of yellow. Over the last bit, it certainly has come down, which is good, but it's now starting to kind of rise back up. And so that's a little bit of an uncertainty. And so we would say that's probably yellow right now. And if we look at testing rates nationally, we can see that we're actually just slightly above 5%. And our rate of testing nationally, you can see in the lower figure, whereas initially it was rising over the last while, since about the new year, our rate of testing nationally has actually dropped, which is also sort of not in the direction that we would like to see. We'd like to see testing rates continue to stay high, and they've actually been dropping. And so in looking at those two metrics, we'd say, okay, those are both probably red. They're definitely moving away from the things we would like to see. We can also look more specifically about what's behind that. This is digging a little bit more into the weeds, but this is looking sort of at individual states in terms of what's happening with their rates of testing. So the figure on the far left is looking at what's happened in terms of testing rate state by state. Has it increased or decreased compared to last week? And so any of the states here in this figure that are orange, their rate of testing is actually decreased compared to last week. And any that are gray, it's stayed pretty consistent. And any that are blue, they've actually increased. And likewise, if we look at that rate of testing as how many tests per 100,000 people, which is also a common metric that's used, we can see that the darker sort of blue-green you are, the better. And you can actually see that the majority of the nation and the majority of states are actually light yellow, which actually puts them at the wrong end of that scale in terms of rate of testing. You can also see that the states that are actually doing the most testing tend to actually be right around where we are located in the Northeast. So in terms of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Connecticut, all of those states tend to be leading the nation in terms of rates of testing, which at least for us more locally is a good thing. Doesn't it make sense that the rate of testing decreases as the rate of vaccination increases? That's the problem. That shouldn't be, if everything is working the way it should, that should not be what happens. The goal should be that regardless of whether you've been vaccinated or not, if you don't feel well and you show symptoms that are COVID-like symptoms, you should be getting tested no matter what. Because the reality is even if you are vaccinated or you're somewhere between your first and second shot, if you're getting the 2-shot vaccine, it is still entirely possible for you to get COVID. And even after you've been fully vaccinated, it is possible for you to get COVID. So regardless of whether you've been vaccinated or not, you should still be getting tested. But the reality, of course, is testing rates have dropped off because people have sort of singularly become focused on, I want to get vaccinated, I'm getting vaccinated, I'm currently in the process of being vaccinated, oh, I've been vaccinated. And now it's like COVID is over. The reality, of course, is that that's not actually the case. COVID is still here. There are still people getting it. And even if you've been vaccinated, there's still, although very small, there is still a chance that you could get it. And so testing is still an important component. But great question. Then after you've looked nationally, you could start looking at, well, what's happening in my state? And so this is the kind of information you can look at the state level. Again, same sorts of things of what we just saw nationally. So here on the left is what's happening to case rates, now looking at the state of Massachusetts. And you can see over the last week or so, our case rates have started to drop, which is encouraging. It hasn't dropped back down to a low enough level where we'd say we're good and we're green, but it's moving in the right direction. And so we'd say, okay, that's probably a yellow. Still not dropped low enough to where we're happy to call it green, but it's moving in the right direction. So that's good. And we could look at positivity. What rate would you call green? So for us here in the state of Massachusetts, we said we wanted to return down to about the level we saw back in the summer in terms of average case rates, because that's when we had things pretty well managed and under control before things sort of really blew up. And so that's kind of what we're looking at the state level, is returning back to that. It's not realistic to say case rates go to zero. COVID is always going to be around and be circulating in our community, but is it at a low enough level where it's well managed? The majority of people have the vaccine, our hospitals aren't overwhelmed, and it's, you know, spreading at only a very slow rate. Then that's kind of what we're looking for. And so for us in Massachusetts, in terms of our rate of testing, which you can see here And in terms of our percent positivity, both of those are where we would like to see them. Less than 5% positivity, and our testing rate is very high. So we would give that a green. And on the national level, that places Massachusetts second and sixth in the nation for those two metrics. But if you are in Maine, for example, we could look at the same sort of data. Likewise, over about the last week, Maine is starting to see a decrease in case rates. They're still higher than probably what you would like to see, back down, somewhere at these levels, for example, but it's going in the right direction. And so you'd say, okay, that's a good yellow. It's moving in the right direction, but not quite back down to where we would like to see. However, when we look at testing rates and percent positivity, the testing rate in the state of Maine is actually quite low. And the percent positivity is actually quite high. If 5% is sort of that threshold, in Maine, as of today, it's actually 7.6%. So quite a bit higher than what we would like to see. And so we'd say, okay, in terms of that, we would give that a red, for example. And in terms of where does that rank nationally, that puts Maine 8th and 26th for those two metrics. And if we looked at New Hampshire, likewise, over the last week, we've seen a decrease in cases, but sort of not quite back to this level, which is where we would kind of want things. So likewise, that's a yellow. But in terms of percent positivity and testing rate, those are still not where we want them to be. And so those would be a red at the 12th and 30th out of the nation for New Hampshire. And then for those folks from Vermont, we can see, again, a more pronounced decrease. That's actually been going on for the past couple of weeks. Which is more encouraging, certainly a good trend. Not quite back down to maybe where we would want to be yet, but definitely a good trend moving in the right direction. So that's a yellow, probably starting to approach or get closer to be going green. And for Vermont, if we look at both their testing rate and positivity, super high rate of testing, super low positivity, third best in the nation on both of those. So that's definitely a solid green there, definitely where we want to be in terms of testing rate and positivity for Vermont. So if you're from Vermont on this call, thumbs up, excellent job. So those are the types of things we can look at the state level. Then we can start looking more locally. And so this, for example, is looking at average case rates for Norfolk County, which is where First Presbyterian is located within Massachusetts. And, we would give this a yellow because over about the last week, it's actually starting to come down. But again, we're not quite back down to sort of the level we want to see just yet, but it's moving in the right direction. We can also look at a whole host of other things. We can look at incidence rates and percentage of testing more locally. So this one, I think, is probably the one that's most interesting for folks. This is looking at the rate of testing, which is the height of those sort of black vertical bars. And in Norfolk County, where our church is located, we've pretty consistently, since about the beginning of the new year, been testing over a 2-week period pretty consistently. Over 100,000 tests every 2 weeks, which for the size of our county is an excellent rate of testing. And the red line here is actually our percent positivity, which you can see is somewhere about 2.25% locally, well below the 5%. So we're in pretty good shape, sort of yellow and red, or pardon me, yellow and green on those two metrics. And then our state and other states take a similar approach. They have, if you go to the state specific website, it'll have a dashboard that'll present all kinds of state specific data. This happens to be the one for Massachusetts. Massachusetts actually gives every sort of community within the state a color coded ranking based on their numbers. And so this is the type of map that we get for Massachusetts. And most of the communities sort of where our church is located on the South Shore, right in here, you can see most of those communities are all yellow. So not quite where we want to be, but moving in the right direction. And the criteria that the state sets for those colors are illustrated here. Each state might use a slightly different set of criteria, but for Massachusetts, for example, this is sort of how the state's health department is ranking communities in terms of color coding. One of the other things we can look at is how quickly is the virus spreading in our communities, right? That's something else that we would be concerned about. And it turns out that epidemiologists have come up with a fancy way of assessing that. It's called the effective reproduction rate, or the RT. It's a complex calculation, which I don't think anybody cares about hearing. This isn't a stats class, and hopefully you've never had to suffer through one, and so we're not going to do that today. But the gist of this measurement is, if you get sick with COVID, how many people are you likely to make sick? And the goal here is for the number to be less than 1, because if it's less than 1, the odds of you infecting even one person are low. But certainly if it's more than 1, that means you're very likely to make at least one person sick, and then they're likely to make one person sick. And you can see how this could start to grow and spread. And so that's a useful one to look at. And for example, here in Massachusetts, we're less than 1, so we're 0.9 as of today. If we look at other states, Maine right now is actually above 1. Which means we are starting to see some community spread right now within Maine. But in the other states like New Hampshire and Vermont, those are also less than 1, which is good, which means the rate of spread is slowing. So that gives us an idea of how quickly it's spreading throughout our communities and our towns and cities. So that's a nice one to look at as well. Then you can really get into things about looking at hospital data. Massachusetts is really good because we have a lot of hospital infrastructure about reporting hospital occupancy rates and things like that. But I think the one a lot of people care about is looking at vaccination rates, right? That's kind of on the forefront of, I think, most people's minds. Is RT from JHU? That's actually from the other one, the London school, the second link that I provided there from the London school and the computer modeling. That they're a good source of the RT value there. So if we look at vaccination rates, you can see in the figure on the left, that's looking at how many doses have been distributed based on county within the state of Massachusetts. And then the table on the right is looking over the last 7 days. How many doses has the state received? How many have been administered? And probably the most interesting thing to look at here is this right here, which is basically telling you day by day over the last week of the doses the state has received, what percentage have been administered, right? Which is a good, a good way of looking at how effective is the state at giving those vaccines. And so being 85% or above is really kind of the target. That means of most of the doses we're getting them out to people, which is good. And then if we look at how many people are fully vaccinated, so as of the 13th of April, which is the most current data that's available, it comes out every week on Thursdays for Massachusetts, just shy of 27% of Massachusetts is fully vaccinated. And likewise, you can access similar information for your specific state by going to your state's Department of Public Health website. So that's really, I think, the type of things that you can look at. And like I say, you don't have to generate a big, huge report, right? And I gather most of you probably have no interest in doing that, nor do you have others in your community that probably want to see it at that level. But if you can generate something at this level, where you pick some things that you want to look at and basically give them a color rating, that I think makes it pretty palatable for your community to look at that and say, okay, we can see why it maybe doesn't make sense to have in-person, in sanctuary worship right now, for example. And I think we'll end by me saying that the other thing I would encourage you to do is be a good source of information for your community. You know, I think most of you, aren't, scientists and healthcare professionals, but that doesn't mean you can't necessarily be available of, what criteria is my state at for giving vaccines? Who's eligible for vaccines? So that you can share that with your community. And as it becomes more available, you can say, oh, we can help you with that. Or here's the website. Do you need help booking a vaccine appointment? We can help you with that. Things like that, supporting your community and being a good source of information. Or when people freak out and hear about blood clots in the news, you can say, well, actually, it sounds bad, but the actual rate of occurrence actually isn't that high. We use the turn of phrase 1 in a million for being something that's really rare. This is like less than 1 in a million. So giving some context, whereas the media really puts it out there like, oh, this is terrible, we're all going to die. The reality is not quite as extreme. And so being comfortable to have those conversations, or at least say, well, let's put a little context with that. So what questions do people have? Because I know that there's a lot of different things we can look at, and I certainly want to help people with that. So please, you can type in the chat. So of these metrics, which 5 or so do you think are the most valuable? I think the most valuable things to look at are try to, first of all, if you have to make a choice, look as local as you can. So look at your county and your city or town. And I think the things you want to look at are case rates, testing rates. I think those are the 2 big things that you really want to look at, because that's giving you a pretty good idea about what's going on. The third, and the one that I would say most people probably want to also look at, is vaccination rates. But don't put all your eggs in that basket, because it's easy to go, well, how many people are vaccinated? Because once we're all vaccinated, everything's fine. If that's true, then that should have the impact on case rates. As more people in your community become vaccinated and it's becoming effective at solving the problem, case rates should drop. So you should see both of those things happening at the same time. So those that I would say be the sort of the big 3 is, and also to try to look as locally as you can. And then look at your state level for those same things to give you a little bit broader context, because probably members of your church community don't just maybe live in your specific town or county. They may be coming from a broader area within your state. And so that would kind of be the things I would say to focus on the most. Can you speak to transmission concerns once in a person if 95% are vaccinated, 5% unvaccinated? Right. So that becomes a question. Right now, we know that the vaccines are effective at preventing individuals from getting COVID. And if you do happen to get it, from preventing it becoming quite severe and leading to fatality. What we only know very little about at this moment is how effective is the vaccine at preventing you, if you get COVID, from being able to spread it to someone else. That is a bit of an unknown right now. There is only limited information and data available that suggests that these vaccines do provide some protection against you spreading it to somebody else. But the data is very limited right now. So the answer to that is we don't know. Just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean that you couldn't get it and still give it to somebody else. Which is why it's still important to encourage members in your community to still do the things that we have been doing: wearing masks, being distanced, washing your hands, making smart decisions in that regard. Because that, along with being vaccinated, is really what's going to get us over the finish line. Each one of these things is only a small tool, but having a collection of tools that you use together is what's going to make the difference. No one thing is going to fix the problem. Vaccination, while great, isn't going to be the singular solution to this issue. Other questions?
If we were so those kind of big three data points, I feel like 14 data points is a lot to me. So I can't
Yeah,
imagine going to my reopening task force with 14 data points,
absolutely.
But 3 to 5 seems reasonable. So like if we were looking at those three, do you feel like to safely regather for worship, you'd want to see green lights in all three or some combination of green and yellow? What feels right to you and to your team at where you are?
Right. So, I mean, that becomes an issue about how many different things are you looking at. I think if you look as locally as you can, so if you're getting your county or your town or city, I think those are the ones that you would really, as locally as you can, you would like to see green. As you start looking a little more broadly at, say, your state level, if those are sort of more yellow, fine, or nationally, if they're yellow or maybe some are still red, that's maybe less of a concern. If more locally, you're in a good situation. And so that's why I recommended sort of the broad to narrow, or the sort of the national, state, and then the local. It's good to have kind of an idea of what's going on nationally, but then what is sort of happening in your community. So yes, it's not realistic to expect every metric from local all the way to national all to be green. That's just not going to happen. But certainly if you look locally as you can in your community, those are the things you'd want to see sort of yellow moving to green. Yeah.
Can I just say another good resource to maybe take to a group of church people? The Wisconsin Council of Churches put together a little guide that seems to really be in line with what you're telling us, Aaron. And they talk about vaccination rates, case rates, and positive test rates. And so that might help you, give you some language that's more like theological. And then you have a nice little graph, which I like because I'm a visual learner.
Yeah, if any of you have had a chance to look at those guidelines that they put out, those are very good and driven by these metrics. Somebody also put in the chat, what if we have a small, not well ventilated space? How much weight should we give that? A lot. That is a big concern. Your space and the logistics of that space are a big part of this. If you have a small, poorly ventilated space for your in-person gatherings, that is a problem because that is the most likely environment for the virus to be communicated. So that should be a big part of it. If you are getting to the point where you think we could think about having in-person services, you want to also make sure that the space where that may be happening is well ventilated and that you can absolutely guarantee that the people that would be within it are physically distanced. If that's a challenge, then that could be a problem. That's where considering things like maybe an outdoor service, if you have a space on your lawn, on your church's property, for example, or within your community that you can use, those are great alternatives. The safest option for gathering right now is outside because it's the best ventilation as possible. And if
what
you
about
oh no, please go ahead.
I was going to say, taking it down a notch from the gathered worship, I know people are anxious to meet in small groups like committees or for a Bible study. Oh, we're all vaccinated, therefore that won't be a problem. We can come together. We can, meet in groups of 8 to 10, and that's really not going to be a problem. It sounds to me like, nah, because who knows where you're coming from and who you've been in touch with, and we still need to practice those basics, even when we're in a 6 to 10 person group, correct?
Yes, we are not at vaccination levels, across the board and across all of our communities yet, where I think that would be reasonable. We're not quite there yet. And as you said, it's still a matter of trying to be safe and responsible. If those groups wanted to meet, you could meet outdoors in somebody's backyard, and sit in lawn chairs that are distanced from people. You could meet that way. That would be a safe way to do it. But the minute you start talking about gathering people indoors, We
Mhm.
really want to be as safe about that as we can possibly be. Does that get at your question, I hope?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure. Somebody else put in the chat, some people are saying we should require vaccination to be indoors. That is a bit of a sticky wicket. That's probably not a term some of you are familiar with. Maybe you are. That becomes tricky for a few reasons, not the least of which is it means you would have to get people to give you health information, which is a big no-no. You cannot ask that. You cannot ask people if they've been vaccinated. You can't ask people if they've had COVID. You cannot ask those things. Which by extension means then that you cannot make plans that are based on knowing that information about your congregation. While conceptually, it seems like the easy solution. Well, if everybody's vaccinated, that helps. And I don't disagree, but we can't take that approach because you cannot ask for that information.
Can I ask, I mean, so I went to my hair salon, they asked if I had a vaccination. I went to the dentist, they asked if I had a vaccination. Of course, the dentist is a medical provider, but the hair salon's not.
Yeah, that's a
I think I
no-no.
visited somebody in a nursing home. They asked if I had my vaccination.
Yeah, that's because, just because they did doesn't mean they should. And you definitely don't want to, have your church community come under the microscope for asking for health-related information. That is a door you do not want to open. Absolutely.
So we have maybe time for one more question. Tom, I think, started talking, so you want to go ahead.
Well, on that front, like this whole conversation about passports and whatever, which I know we haven't gotten there yet, but is that going to be a possibility, or is it a likelihood, or is it like, no, we're never going to get past the health information part?
I mean, it's going to be a challenge. You will see vaccination passports essentially used everywhere else in the world except for here. And that is an unfortunate side effect of the way that healthcare and politics work in this country. You've already seen different states move at the state level to ban the use of them, which is unfortunate. And even if your state allows it, there will inevitably be people that will refuse. It's going to be hard for that to be implemented in an effective way in this country. Let alone the fact about getting the majority of this country vaccinated because of the large amount of vaccine hesitancy. That is a huge issue that we are going to be dealing with over the next 3 to 5 years. Is that this is going to be circulating to some extent within our community for a long time. And it's going to vary depending on how many people have been vaccinated and how many people refuse to be vaccinated. And then as global travel starts to return, it remains to be seen what impact that is going to have. But certainly places across Europe and even in North America, places like Canada and Mexico are very likely to require proof of vaccination for you to travel to those countries. So certainly as you start looking to travel outside of the US, that's absolutely going to be a requirement. Within the US is going to be a hodgepodge.
Thank you, Aaron, so much. We really appreciate all of this information. I see lots of applause.
Oh, thank you very much. The only other thing I just really wanted to express to people is you have my email in those slides, please. At any point now, 3 months from now, a year from now, if you have questions or things you want to talk about or want clarification on, you can certainly email me. We can set up a time to chat or whatever. I'm happy to do that because I realize there's a lot out there. There's a lot of unknowns. I'm happy to talk to people about any of this at any time now or in the future.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
As we are at the end of our time today, I just want to ask those who are gathered here, is there another, Carl and I have kind of been wondering, this is the third in a series of who knows how many times that we have met together. And so are there other topics related to regathering or just pastoring during COVID or church leadership during COVID that would be interesting for you all, that you feel like you need a group to talk about? Would it be helpful if we did something like this regularly at a certain time each month and you would know you could always dip in? What do you think? What do you think?
And
some
maybe just to
examples as
tag onto
we're
that,
going. Yeah, go ahead.
just to tag onto that a little bit. I mean, a couple of ideas were, we had heard at one of our previous sessions that, you know, sort of how we communicate this within the church. That was one topic. Another topic was, you know, what about kids during COVID? And, you know, we could get some school educators and other, you know, Christian educators to come be a part of it. If people wanted to have a conversation about like, hey, what about the nuts and bolts of doing outdoor worship? You know, those would be like a few topics that we thought we could either do as a whole group, or, you know, we could get together and have like a little focus group conversation about those. People looking for more of this kind of conversation, or?
Yeah, I think another question I still have is like, if the CDC is saying even vaccinated people shouldn't gather in large groups, does any of the data matter? Or should we just be telling our task forces and our churches that the CDC still says you shouldn't gather in groups indoors? I think I'm sort of struggling with that. You know, when our local data is good, if that's still the CDC advice, what do I go with?
Right. And that's always going to be the challenge. You know, the CDC is trying to give a perspective nationally. I mean, I think that's the first takeaway, is trying to give a consistent message nationally, and what your town or community may look like is likely to be substantially different than sort of what the national trend is. I think the other takeaway is their comments are about sort of large gatherings. I think the other piece of this is when you do think about doing, say, an in-person service, is thinking about the size as well, and maybe realizing that there's no way we could have our entire congregation come. Maybe we break it up into a smaller group of maybe, you know, 10 or 20 people at most that may come when we get to that point, to limit the size and things like that as well, and shorten the length of the service. So the amount of time that we're in that confined space is also shorter. So those are some of like the logistical sides about when we get to that point, what does it look like, that you'd want to consider as well.
Thank you, everybody. Good question. It's 2:00, so we do want to close with a prayer. Carl, do you have anything else you want to add? I think what we're going to do is schedule another time in May for a meeting, and we will judge based on what the response to that is like, if we need to do it. Does that seem right?
That sounds good. I see some thumbs up. I think maybe we're losing Megan. So I'll close this with a prayer. Are you back, Megan, to real time?
Sorry about that. It's frozen. It just started
Yeah.
pouring rain at my house and I was frozen. Okay, I think I'm back.
Yeah, you're back.
This is another prayer from Out of the Silence into the Silence, Prayers Daily Round. 10 out of 10 would recommend. And we'll do it responsively. So if you would like to turn your microphone on, and
I think we're losing her. So I don't have her resource. I'll close this.
go ahead.
Oh, you're back. Let's try it.
I don't know if it's okay. Third time's a charm. The response is nothing can separate us from the love of God. Okay, so I will say nothing, and everyone reply, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Okay. No affliction, no hardship, nothing. Nothing
can separate us from the love of God.
No hunger, no thirst, no cold, no fire, nothing.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
No persecution, no danger, no sword, nothing.
Nothing can separate us
from the love of our God.
No terror, no knife, no bomb, nothing.
Nothing
Nothing
can
separate us from the love of God.
No landmine, no gun, no disease, nothing.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
No poison, no shock, no sudden death, nothing.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
There is nothing in death or in life, nothing.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
No powers that be, no evil's grip, nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
In the world as it is, or the world as it shall be, nothing. Nothing
Can separate us from the love of God.
There is nothing in the whole of creation. Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
You have embodied your love for us in Jesus. In your spirit, we stammer our thanks. We shall trust in your presence through all that is to come, knowing nothing.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
Amen.
Amen.